So just to wrap things up here, Jonas really offers us two reasons to think that mortality, in the sense that we will ultimately die, that our deaths are an inevitable part of our future, is a blessing. The first one is really a civilizational, communal sense in which we care about the human race, and if the human race were to sort of stop in terms of creating new people at this point, then we wouldn't recognize it, and it wouldn't be a good thing. He makes certain claims which I think are questionable about it becoming frozen or stagnant, but that's he makes a case. But then there is, of course, the question about whether okay, we do care about civilization, but what about me, right? What if I were to continue to live on an individual level? Isn't that something I would welcome? Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, would you individually, irrespective of whether anyone else were to live forever or for centuries and centuries, very long time, would you want to? If you could avoid death individually, would you? That's when he says, at the end, he says, let us judge on purely egotistical grounds. That is, again, putting aside our concerns for the species or for the race, the human race. Would you accept immortality? Somebody offered you the immortality pill, would you take it? Jonas thinks that you should not, for purely individual reasons. And one of those is something that's been discussed elsewhere in philosophy, and that is the idea that the human mind and the human memory have a certain limit in terms of the ability to assimilate new experiences or to remember old ones. And that if we were to live for a very long time, multiples of the current human lifespan, either we would have to stop, because in a certain sense we were full, we would have to stop assimilating new experiences, and that wouldn't be any sort of life. We would always be living in the past. Or we would have to gradually forget our past experiences, which I think is more likely, in order to be able to assimilate new ones. And that would mean that essentially we would become different persons. There's a very, very wonderful short story by the writer, poet Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentinian writer, where he imagines a man reading a translation of Homer from the Greek into the English in the 18th century. And he's reading the book, he's on a sea voyage, and he's enjoying the book. And then it occurs to him that he was Homer, right? And that he was an ancient person who discovered the secret of immortality and was once Homer and many other people. It's just that he's forgotten. He's lived so long that he's forgotten that he was these past people. That essentially, it's a very clever idea the way it's presented by Borges, but the idea is if you did live for very, very long periods of time, you would essentially forget so much about your former lives that you would become a succession of what were, for all practical purposes, different persons through time. And that would mean that the whole idea of personal immortality would be made meaningless, because we would not be the person we are now. If we long for eternal life, it's as the person we are, not being someone else, right? If you can say that. And that's an interesting, again, very interesting idea. I do tend to think about Star Trek a lot, and the older ones amongst you may remember the Star Trek TV series. And one of the interesting things about the Vulcan species, one of the alien species that's part of the show, is that they have lifespans of like 300 years. And they sort of feel sorry for human beings for only living 70 or 80 years. And they're quite comfortable with being the same person over 300 years. So it's a kind of a counterexample. I mean, it's always fictional, but it makes you think that this claim that we would not be able to maintain our personal identity through very long periods of time, I think, is another questionable one. Jonas makes, although very plausible. And I think finally, one of the things he talks about is that, as you get older and culture changes, it may be that, sure, you can continue to have new experiences, but the world changes. And he gives the example of his experience of art. This is a man born maybe around 1910-ish. No, maybe around the turn of the century, actually. Who was always a great lover of art. Now it's the 80s and 90s, and he's like, what is going on, right? He says, I can still be moved by the works I have learned to love and and have grown old with, but the art of our own time is alien to me. I don't understand its language. And in that respect, I already feel a stranger in the world. I mean, being 52 years old, I can certainly empathize with that to a certain extent. There's whole genres of, especially popular music and to some degree film, that I can sort of recognize as having value, no doubt, but I just don't have any sympathy for it because my tastes were formed at an earlier age. And one of the interesting experiences of growing old as a teacher is that your references become outdated, completely outdated. I hesitate to make a Star Trek reference, talk about Mr. Spock or the Vulcans, or refer to the great movies of my youth, The Godfather, all sorts of other great movies in the 70s and 80s. So that actually does happen in the sense that you do sort of become obsolete. The world moves on and you don't really move on with it. And, whether that's a reason for not wanting to be around anymore, I'm not so sure, but it's certainly something to think about in terms of his that mortality. Ultimately, the fact that we will die is a blessing.